I want to thank Dr. Jung Pak for being with us this morning. We're looking forward to a really interesting conversation about her new book, Becoming Kim Jong Un. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, let me thank everybody for joining us this morning. It's a very interesting topic and one where it's hard to find a lot of deep expertise. So we appreciate this opportunity today. The center has, for the last 55 years, endeavored to support a better functioning relationship between the executive and legislative branch for the purposes of creating a better functioning federal government system, but also of delivering on some specific national security aims. We have been focused on a set of national security issues, most recently including trying to maintain America's predominant position in space, also focusing on rapidly advancing technologies that will affect geopolitical competitions, particularly with China, including artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, 5G communications, and others. We are very interested in the evolution of the great powers competition. And I think we have developed and are in the process of developing a pretty good handle on how we understand Russia, how we understand China and their motivations, and how we balance our need to continue to be a leader and integrate in world trade, but also protect America's national security and compete. When it comes to North Korea, it is a bedeviling challenge. We have had some speakers come talk with us recently about the role that intelligence plays in providing the United States information that it needs, context, perspective that it needs to try to make the right decisions to benefit our national security. But it seems to me that when it comes to North Korea, the intelligence side of the equation is probably about the most challenging that we face. So we are very much looking forward to hearing Dr. Pak's thoughts on trying to unpack and tackle that very difficult situation with North Korea, particularly with a dictatorship, understanding the psychology and the motivations of the leader is as important as trying to gather intelligence on the capabilities and the actions of your adversary. So there's a lot to look at here today. But we are looking forward to hearing from you, Dr. Pak, about the lessons you outline in Becoming Kim Jong Un. And what we're going to do is I'm going to turn over the floor to you first, let you make any comments you'd like on your work in the book. After your remarks, we will open up the floor and give an opportunity for other participants to ask you questions. And Dan Mahaffee will moderate that. What I will remind folks is that you can either, when Dr. Pak is finished with her opening remarks, you can either submit a question using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or if you open the participants panel, you can use the raise hand button and Dan will call on you. And Dan will remind us of how we can do this when we're ready to go to audience questions. But Dr. Pak, thank you so much for your lifetime of work. And also for being with us this morning. Let me turn it over to you to hear your thoughts on what you've learned.
Thank you, Representative Nye, and thanks to Dan and others from CSPC for inviting me. This is a really great pleasure for me to be joining you. And I was going through my files, and I was looking through, and I saw that I had participated in the Presidential Fellows Leadership Conference in October of 2019. Oh, wow. And so that was my first experience with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. And I have to say, and this was on the conference was on the current state of the U.S.-led global order. There were 3 women national security professionals on the panel with, in the panel with me. And these presidential fellows from your organization, Representative Nye, came from all over the country and all over the world. Really smart, and they asked wonderful questions, and it was really a thrill to be speaking with them back in October of 2019. And it reminded me that the work of the CSPC and other organizations that do this kind of programming, it's so important to create that community of service leaders, and to instill that sense of that the individual can learn, can educate others, and to work in the service of civic dialogue and principled leadership. And I'm really happy to be joining you today, as well as that day in October of 2019. So I was going through the organization and the mission, and I was really happy to see that it grew out of President Eisenhower's desire for how to capture the historical lessons of governance and how to use those lessons to tackle the challenges of today and for the future. And I'm not sure if many of the participants today know this, but I came in through the national security field through history, and studying the Cold War and studying the U.S. history from the 19th century onward. And so when I think about the lessons of history and the lessons of governance, I'm tapping into, as I did with the book, my experience as a history professor in New York, my training as a historian, and I'm really happy to be able to put that into the book, as well as to talk about what lessons of governance that we have learned from looking at Kim Jong Un. And I wanted to look at some leadership lessons that Kim has taken from his past, and the way that the organization CSPC has been looking at the lessons of the past to project our better our future. So when I look at the leadership lessons of Kim Jong Un, one is connect with the people. And what was so interesting about when he came to power is that, first of all, this is the third Kim in this dynasty of Kims to rule North Korea since 1945. When Kim Jong Un came to power, he had just turned 20. He was just shy of 28. And when he gave his first public speech, he was just, he was 28 years old, taking over this nuclear weapons possessing country. And in that first meeting, or this first parade that he presided over, celebrations in April of 2012, he gave a public speech to the people. And that was surprising to many of us in the intelligence community, and it was something to note, and other experts outside of government have noted this as well. This was the first time that the North Korean people have heard their leader's voice for the first time in 17 years. Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, had spoken once and was very brief, and he never did it again because he hated the way his squeaky voice sounded, and he was just not as projecting of his personality as the Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-un, for that matter. So when Kim Jong-un gave his first public speech, he was hearkening back to his grandfather's days. In his grandfather's days, it was things were much better. They had the support of the Soviet Union. They had largesse from the Soviet bloc. There was a lot of money and aid and concessionary trade coming from the Soviet bloc and from the Soviet Union. And Kim Jong-un also likened himself or fashioned himself to look like his grandfather. But this was, think about, when we think about giving a speech, when a leader gives a speech, it's what it does is that it creates this intimacy. So rather than having speeches published in the newspapers or published in the Party Daily, having the leader in Kim Jong-un talking directly to the people, harken back to the old days of Kim Il-sung, but it also creates this intimacy between the leader and the people. And so that after 4 months of taking power, that Kim Jong-un was doing this, he was right off the bat trying to create that connection with the people. And when we compare Kim Jong-un to his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, I'm reminded of a declassified CIA assessment that I found, that I included in the book, about how, imagine the governor of a state like Pennsylvania traversing the country, traversing the state 200 days of the year. Think about how many connections that leader can make. And this is something that Kim Jong-un has done as well. he's on the road, he's constantly on his on-the-spot guidances, whether it's a lubricant factory or a missile test, he's constantly present. And this, again, harkens back to the lessons from his grandfather, which is to create that connection with the people, not just through speeches at these massive gatherings, but also in more intimate settings at factories, schools, orphanages, and office buildings, or shops for that matter. And so Kim has been doing that with the shopping centers, creating that intimacy, making sure that he's omnipresent, just like his grandfather was. And the second lesson of governance that I think Kim has learned from the past is to provide a hope and vision. Unlike his father, Kim Jong-il, who became the leader of North Korea as North Korea was entering a famine, Kim Jong-il said, let's tighten our belts, and he's also started a let's eat 2 meals a day campaign. Kim Jong-un, his son, on the other hand, came in with in terms of, in his first speech, he said very specifically, there won't be any more belt tightening. That this was a specific optimistic vision where he embraced his youth while others were scoffing at his youth and experience, to say that under his watch, he will be forward thinking, that his youth is an asset, and that he'll be able to lead North Korea into this bright future where his youth, his vitality, his vigor, and his vision and optimism for the future is going to infuse the country to this great economic prosperity. Kim also had this very confident, very optimistic policy of Pyeongjin, which is the dual track, that North Koreans don't have to tighten their belts, but that they can have nuclear weapons and prosperity. That these things are not contradictory, but that they're complementary. And this is something that he can do because of who he is, because of his vision, and injecting hope into the population. And he did so through physically as well. While we're much more familiar with the missile tests and the monuments to the war, the Korean War, and how the nuclear weapons program has been a strong part of the centrality, has been the center of his branding for himself. Kim has also created this pastel wonderland. That trajectory started with his father, but Kim really accelerated that, where he has dotted the North Korean landscape with amusement parks, skate parks, high-end restaurants, coffee shops, dolphinariums, riding clubs. These are all the accoutrements of a modern 21st century successful culture. And so we have this juxtaposition of roller coasters in Pyongyang next to these monuments to the war, where there are these graphic images of from the Korean War with the U.S. soldiers brutally treating the North Koreans. And so we have this hope and vision aspect of his leadership. Third, to supplement those things, the hope and vision, and to create intimacy with the people and connect with the people, if that doesn't work, fear works. And if anything, fear has been part of, or instilling fear has been a part of the regime's infrastructure. And it's also been a part of the governance model that Kim Jong-un has inherited and also has been looking to boost. And so since the 1950s, Kim Il-sung and the North Korean government has been categorizing people, and they have instituted penitentiaries, a network of penitentiaries, as well as prison camps, labor camps, where people, along with 3 generations of that family, are sent to prison camps to knock out to extract the root of corruption or bad thinking or non-socialist or anti-socialist or anti-regime thinking away from society. In this culture of fear and this repressive infrastructure goes from at the neighborhood network, where you have neighborhood surveillance teams, as all the way up to the national level, where you have multiple and overlapping security apparatuses to make sure that people are spying on each other, spying on each other's organizations, and stovepiping to make sure that the repressive that the fear of what might happen to them and their families keep the bureaucracy as well as the people pliant. And I also wanted to talk about the challenges of today and how Kim has applied those lessons to the challenges of today and to the future. One of the things that I point out in the book is that that Kim has looked to expand the geographies of control. And so that it's not just about what's on the ground physically, but also in the cyber digital realm. First, and I would point out that Kim is a digital native. He grew up with technology. He has technology is embedded in the way he thinks, in the way that that you might not necessarily associate with North Korea, a closed society. Even in regime media, you can see him not just looking at with things like laptops, tablets, smartphones, and this has become almost universal or ubiquitous in North Korean society. They're not cheap, but it's a status symbol and as well as a necessity. So Kim has used technology to push people onto digital platforms to better control them. And I think this is a recognition, as I articulated in the book, that information is getting in. People are watching South Korean dramas and Chinese soap operas and movies, and that information has been exchanged and collected along the porous 900-mile border with China as the market economy has grown since the 1990s. Kim has created websites, shopping websites, cooking sites, and encouraged the use of, people have been using technology to get in touch with each other, to shop. But what that also does is that it gives the regime a greater tools for control of the people, so they can. So this is a closed network. The North Koreans have basically created an alternative reality with this digital network, and that while that also is a sign of this consumerism that has emerged in North Korea, but it's also a surveillance or a control mechanisms to make sure that the regime can keep track of what its people are saying and doing. Secondly, in expanding the geography of his control, Kim has really grown a network, a group of cyber guerrillas, reminiscent of the guerrillas, the Manchurian guerrillas and the guerrillas against anti-Japanese imperialism in the 20s and the 30s of his grandfather. Some credible reports suggest that Kim has thousands of people and support staff sprinkled throughout the world in permissive environments, and these cyber tools are used to punish and coerce, as in the Sony hack of 2014. But also, as we've seen from the UN panel of experts reports and other really great research from research institutes, is that the North Korean hackers are getting better at extracting money through ransomware, malware. They have tapped into banks around the world, and that the UN has estimated that as much as the North Korean hackers have generated as much as $2 billion worth of funds that would go directly to the regime. In looking at the challenges of today, I think Kim has really adopted and embraced the technology, recognizing that if left to themselves, that have the potential to be destabilizing for his rule. But in embracing this and harnessing this and co-opting the technologies, he's been trying to connect, not just connect with the people, but also to make sure that he has expanded the realm of his control over his people and what they're doing and saying and shopping for. So in going forward, I think we have to, the purpose of my book, my motivation for writing the book was to suggest that, Kim is more than just his missiles. Kim is more than just his nuclear weapons test, but that there is this universe of what we can understand about Kim in terms of his hopes, his aspirations, his leadership style, where he's trying to go with his governance, how he uses history, and how he tries to step away from that history or to step out of the shadows of his grandfather and father, and that we have to acknowledge the totality of his understanding and of his personality to really get at how to solve this the problems that North Korea poses regionally as well as globally. So Representative Nye, let me stop there and push it back to you.
Thank you so much for your work on the book and for walking us through your process. I just want to remind participants that you can pose questions using either the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, or if you open the participants panel, you can digitally raise your hand, and Dan Mahaffee will call on you and you can pose your question. Let me ask one question though, something that I wanted to start with. And essentially the broad question is going to revolve around this notion is, I'd like to get your assessment on how well we've learned how to deal with Kim Jong Un. We've tried various strategies when it comes to negotiating with North Korea, whether it be trying to use China as a balancing element, or as President Trump has tried, direct contact with leader to leader at the summit level. They don't seem to change the trajectory of the arc much, but I'm hoping that you could shed some light on it from your perspective on what we've learned from our various efforts to try to reach out and bend the historical arc with North Korea. And in the context for my question is, I was very interested in reading Joshua Huminski's review of your book, that he noted your mentioning of some of the analytical tactics and some of the pitfalls, and one of them was mirror imaging, this concept of if I say it correctly, the assumption that other actors will act as we would or respond as we would to stimuli. I mentioned Russia and China and great powers, and I think we're getting a handle on sort of understanding the motivations there on the sort of Russia-China side of things, how they see the world. And, we are able to predict with some information what's likely to happen, what their leadership is likely to do. With North Korea, it seems like we just haven't quite figured it out. But let me know if I'm missing something here, and then just help us from your perspective on what we've learned so far with our attempts to try to solve that equation.
Right, thank you. So we've been dealing with North Korea for the past couple of decades, and despite the slew of sanctions, despite the tightening of the ability of North Korea's ability to generate revenue, and despite the various and different tactics and strategies that the United States have attempted over the years, what's been clear is that, and this is the intelligence community's assessment, and it has been for a while, is that North Korea is highly unlikely to give up its nuclear weapons or to bargain them away irreversibly in the absence of a belief by the regime that having nuclear weapons threatens the regime versus enabling and reinforcing the power of the Kim family and the bureaucracy. And I think that Kim Jong Un is even more unlikely than his father and his grandfather to give up nuclear weapons because he inherited an advanced program. He has never known a non-nuclear North Korea. And so as this generation ages in North Korea, they have not known a non-nuclear North Korea either, so that it becomes a part of the education, it becomes a part of the cultural and political and social mentality of not just the top leadership, but also the people. And so to give it away in exchange for economic benefits, I think Kim might see that as the ultimate betrayal of his father and his grandfather. And I think, what you mentioned, mirror imaging. A great deal of the way I think about this has been informed by my CIA training, in addition to my training as a historian. And Richard Hoyer's book on psychology of intelligence analysis, which was the Bible of CIA analysts, has been a big part of the way I think about North Korea. North Korea is the hardest of the hard targets. The other two you mentioned, China and Russia. But China and Russia have both multiple networks, multiple points of contact with the United States, and they're more obviously engaged with the world. But North Korea is very different in that they are engaged with the world in the thousands of cyber warriors or business, the weapons dealers, diplomats and other people, small-scale business people who are trying to make money and generate revenue, whether they're operating restaurants or smuggling or trafficking in women and girls across the border. So I think what we can learn about, what I worry about is when we look at Kim Jong Un, is that because it's a hard target, because it's so hard to get information, because it's so hard to elicit or extract understanding of what Kim is thinking about and the regime intentions, that we start putting our own perceptions into how we analyze North Korea. So I think so President Trump was working off the assumption that because Kim controls the nuclear weapons program, that we have to have this leader-to-leader connection. And I think that was probably, that was worth trying because this is something that all of the Kims had wanted for a long time, is to meet with the sitting U.S. president. I think that the problem here in the extreme bilateral relationship or the negotiations or diplomacy that we've had between President Trump and Kim Jong Un is that Kim doesn't want the same things. Kim doesn't want that he doesn't want the condos. That he wants economic prosperity, but he wants them on his terms. He wants them that in a way that doesn't threaten his rule. He doesn't want railroads networking throughout the country, because railroads create instability because people are trading ideas, people are traveling, and so I think that we have to be really careful about putting our own perceptions, our own preferences onto Kim, and to see it from his perspective. Representative Nye, I think when I think my value added in writing this book is that a lot, the years that I spent in the intelligence community, we don't speak from the U.S. perspective. We always speak from the adversary's perspective. And so I spent, almost 9 years trying to get into the mind of Kim Jong Un, how he perceives things, and how why he's doing what he does, what are his motivations and drivers, which make no sense to us, frankly, in many ways, but they make sense to him. And so I look back on Dennis Rodman and how I remember, people, just casually speaking with coworkers back in Langley, how why did Kim meet with Dennis Rodman instead of the chairman of Google, who was also in North Korea at the time? This seemed like a highly, it was a mistake. Why wouldn't you meet with the chairman of Google versus Dennis Rodman? And this didn't make sense from our perspective, because we're thinking in the perspective of business. We're talking in the perspective of status. But for Kim, I think it was that he wanted to show that he didn't care. He wanted to be non-political. He wanted to have fun. He loved basketball as a kid. And I think this might have been a way of showing the elders in the regime and outside that he's going to do things his way. And that if that was the message that he wanted to convey, then he conveyed that. So I think we have to be really careful about how we try to plant our own assumptions on or our preferences on Kim moving forward.
Dan, I'll go over to you for the audience Q&A. Looks like we've got quite a list of questions already submitted.
Yep, we got a list of text questions submitted, but we've also got a hand raised, Maria Paula Aguilar. I'm going to turn on your audio so you can ask your question of Dr. Pak.
Hi, can you hear me now? Okay, cool. So first of all, thank you for this panel. I was on the October 2019 conference and I enjoyed that panel as much as I'm enjoying this one. And actually, I was wondering, I already have your book link on Amazon, so I think I will buy it very soon. It's very interesting. And I would like to ask you, like on the previous months, it was this rumor about if Kim Jong Un had died or not. And even if it's a rumor or not, I was wondering what is his legacy, or how would things must be like run in the regime, in the North Korean regime, in case these rumors were true or not. But like beyond that, how is the North Korea regime going to live up? And also, I think that rumors raise some questions regarding the current international order and the way relations and alliances have been built towards North Korea. So what are like your point of view on this, and how do you think like probably the regime and also those relations are going to change from now on?
Maria, thank you, and thanks for letting me know that you were in the October 2019 meeting. That was really great energy in that room. On the rumors of Kim's death, I think what we learned from that back when he was absent from public view for 3 weeks was that the regime is much more resilient than we think it is, and that what we noticed, and it also showed us how hard a target North Korea is. We had so much fragmentary information coming from all sorts of places, from sources in North Korea, from business people, from Chinese internet and chat rooms, and from CNN and other major media in the United States and globally, that it was really hard to figure out like what was happening. But regardless of what, whether it was coronavirus that drove him away from public view, or that he had heart surgery or some other kind of health issue taken care of, what was important there is to show the implications of all of that, so that there are significant implications to his absence, and that how do we prepare for this? And in the intelligence community, it's much more about it's less about predicting what's going to happen, but to avoid surprise for policymakers and for the U.S. president. And so to work out the various scenarios. So how stable is the regime in his absence? What we saw in those 3 weeks was that people were still going to work. The borders were still locked down. People, the North Korean soldiers were still, patrolling the borders. Smuggling continued to happen. People stayed in quarantine. I mean, so the daily lives of North Koreans kept going because people just kind of did their own thing. And when Kim was also absent in 2014 for 6 weeks for ankle surgery or ankle issues or some other health issue, we saw stability then too. And I think this is, but it also shows us that that stability can only go so far. What if he had been absent for 6 weeks? What if there's uncertainty about his health status? We might start to see elites start jockeying for position or aligning with different avenues of power. And I think this is, this episode has passed in terms of Kim's health so far as we can tell. But we have to be really careful about and be thinking way in advance about how to talk about and think about and collaborate with our allies and partners about what if. And so to avoid the surprise, we talked about alliances back in October, and that's one of the things that have eroded in the past few years. And what we saw as Kim is maneuvering, Kim sees if he sees cleavages the North Koreans will try to drive wedges between and among alliances, to take advantage of national priorities, to take advantages of misunderstanding or disagreements, to try to move forward. And so one of the big lessons, I think this goes back to Representative Nye's question too, is that we can try different things. We have tried different things, but alliances matter. And alliances matter in terms of getting our friends across the globe implementing sanctions to make sure that no fissile material or other sensitive technologies are being transferred to or from North Korea. And so alliances really is our bread and butter in terms of dealing with North Korea. Thank you, Maria.
The next questions I see in the Q&A, and I'm going to combine these, but they both have to do with how things get into North Korea, given how closed of a society it is. And the first thread is economic. So given the sanctions, given the control, given ostensibly the pressure that's supposed to be coming from outside, what are the resources that are being used for this economic reform, these theme parks, this embryonic middle class that people seem to talk about? And then at the same time, with technology and change, what do we know of how information is getting into North Korea? What is the sense of the information that North Koreans are getting in a ostensibly digital and interconnected era?
On the first question, how are people making money? Is that it? And then the second is information. How are people making money? So North Koreans have been, since the 1990s, for survival, have increased their trading networks and have used the 900-mile porous border with China to trade and to use those trading and smuggling networks to generate revenue. And so there's a robust market, black market, gray market, various shades of gray markets in North Korea, and the regime has generally turned a blind eye to that because it's good for the regime because they can as North Koreans are making money, it looks good for the regime. And you know, the way that and I think this the recent indictments that were released by in the past couple of days show how the North Koreans have been doing this, and the UN panel of experts reports are very instructive in how the North Koreans are making money. So they're and so, you know, diplomats are always charged with making money. People who go overseas, weapons dealers and others have been trying and have been great entrepreneurs for decades because they've had to. The regime has told anybody who goes abroad to make money, you have to fend for yourselves, to pay the electric bills in your embassy. But also, you know, this is the way they generate money through insurance fraud, or, you know, weapon sales and you know, cigarette smuggling or cognac smuggling and all sorts of things. But you know, in the past couple of days, there was an indictment that was that became public, and the North Koreans, working with Chinese intermediaries and other intermediaries, have created 250 shell companies across the world. Their businessmen and North Korean entrepreneurs are running around various parts of the world, Libya, China, obviously, and also places where it's where they can freely move around and they see a permissive environment. And so this is the way that you know, it gives a snapshot or the extent of the North Korean money-making networks to try to generate revenue for themselves and for the regime. And on North Korea information, information is getting in, and that there is this thirst for information. And I think Sandra Fahey and Jung Pak and others have done really, and the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea have done really great work in getting the voices of defectors who have told us that information is getting in, and that there are that, you know, as people do more businesses and they're smuggling and they're traveling, that the information does get in. But but it's the what kind of information works. So I think just because that information is getting in doesn't necessarily translate into protests. But I think the goal of information penetration, if we have that as a policy, and I think we should, is that it's to create internal sources of accountability, to create to ensure that North Korea loosens its repressive practices. It's a violator of human rights, and I think that if we have to try to create pressure within the regime and to create accountability for the regime to take care of its own people. So if we're looking at generating political rights, civic responsibilities, government responsibilities, and I think that's the way that we should be thinking about North Korean information penetration.
The next question asks, given the history of US policies towards North Korea and their seeming ineffectiveness, as the questioner says, what would you say, though, we have gotten right about North Korea, or perhaps what are we getting right about North Korea?
On the policy ineffectiveness, when I look at the history of North Korea policy, there are right elements, I think, or there are good elements throughout in the various policies, trying engagement, diplomacy, as well as pressure. But let's set aside the counterproliferation sanctions. I think that is just a given. I think we have to make sure that is something that that we all agree on, that we don't want sensitive North Korean nuclear technologies flowing into and out of North Korea. So what are we doing right? I think part of our policy ineffectiveness is that while we and the South Koreans and the Chinese government, as well as the Russians to a certain extent, and Japan as well, is that we think in terms of electoral cycles. We think in terms of 4 years or 8 years, whereas the North Koreans think in terms of dynasties. And when you think in terms of dynasties, you make small tactical steps to try to move forward a couple of steps, but that in effect that the core or the fundamentals don't change. Whereas I think because we are a democracy, because we have government accountability, and as well as the governments in Seoul and Tokyo, is that policies change, and so where we keep trying different things, and I think this is something that we should not trade away, obviously, but it's something that requires a lot of discipline and a lot of bipartisan or nonpartisanship on North Korea policies to make sure that we have sustainability of these policies. And what I think North Korea is reluctant to give away reluctant to bargain away its nuclear weapons is because they have no reason to think that the US or South Korea or Beijing or others would be true to those commitments. As presidents change, as governments change, the previous arrangements or commitments have been jettisoned. And I think this is not a new thing in terms of North Korea. They felt betrayed in the past, like when China decided to normalize ties with China, its closest ally and only ally, decided to normalize ties with South Korea in the 90s, and turning its back on North Korea in terms of sanctions implementation or agreeing to sanctions. So for Kim, he can't trust anybody but himself. He can't trust anybody with the nuclear weapons program. It's all on him. And I think this is something that we have to understand, that we need some sort of we need a sustainable North Korea policy to pressure North Korea, but two, also to assuage North Koreans' fears about what would happen to agreements that it might potentially agree to. What are we doing right? Over the years, when I look at all of this, that what we do right, and or what works is that that is being very closely aligned, and U.S. leadership, as well as being closely aligned with our allies and partners in the region. Without them, sanctions mean nothing. Without them, U.S. leadership means nothing, and it really erodes North Korea's, erodes our credibility from the perspective of North Korea if we're not leading, and if we're not, if we're bickering with our allies.
The next question asks, what are the risks of miscalculation between Pyongyang and Washington, or perhaps miscalculation in one capital or the other? But what do you see as those risks? And I might add too, since it's kind of broad, what is the risk? Are there particular touch points where you're concerned about miscalculation?
Yes, on miscalculation, we talk about this a lot in the intel business, and making sure that the low probability, high impact scenarios don't come to fruition. And I worry about miscalculation, particularly with Kim, when, because he's so aggressive, and his default is aggressiveness and boldness in military. So even during coronavirus, when everybody was locked down back in March, he conducted more missile tests than he had in the past year. And so to show strength, and to project strength, he's inclined to be more aggressive and bold and use the nuclear weapons program as that leverage. I worry about miscalculation a lot because I think it would be a mistake so North Korea has said that, the Kim regime has said that its nuclear weapons are for defensive purposes, for deterrence. But I worry about how much of his grandfather's revolutionary zeal is coursing through Kim Jong Un's veins, to unify the peninsula, which has always been a meta goal of the North Korean regime. But given the ICBMs that he has tested, given the enormous nuclear weapons that he has tested in the past couple of years, and the erosion of the alliance networks, how much that feeds into his confidence about using nuclear diplomacy or coercion for offensive measures, such as creating conditions that would be favorable for unification on his terms. I don't think that's a 5-year thing. I don't think that's a 10-year thing. But I worry about that we might underestimate his ambitions. We also don't want to overestimate his ambitions, so I think it's a tricky balance that we have to maintain. Miscalculation, we came close to it in 2017, and I think because of 2017, we're much more prone to miscalculation. There was a lot of talk about war back in 2017, and even if it's not intended, there's a really big potential for regimes, governments, one side or the other, to try to preempt or to try to take the initiative. And what I worry about is that Kim's lesson from 2017 and the abrupt pivot to diplomacy in 2018, when President Trump said that he wanted to meet with him, was that the U.S. is a paper tiger. That despite all of the threats lobbed against the regime, all of the planning and all of the military movements, that ultimately that the U.S. doesn't want war. And this is something that I elaborated on in the book, and I elaborated on in my foreign affairs article, that we have validated Kim's fundamental assumptions about the U.S., which is that we don't want war, that we don't want another war, we don't want to disrupt the global economy, we don't want to expend potentially millions of lives in South Korea or in China or in Japan for a war with North Korea, and that might have lengthened Kim's perception of how long his leash is. And so while we haven't seen a deadly attack perpetrated by North Korea since 2010. I think North Korea will continue to poke and prod and see how long its leash is in terms of acting provocatively and trying to create conditions that would be favorable for him.
Oops. I'm going to combine a couple questions we've got here that discuss historical analogs and your own training as a historian. One, looking at the historical lessons of compare Libya to Iran and their experiences, as well as the experience of German reunification. How do you think Kim Jong Un looks at those as his own historical lessons? And finally, too, what are there comparable historical analogs that we can also consider in dealing with a regime like North Korea, or is it sui generis in its own way?
Let me try to keep track of the various questions on the So on Libya and Iran, neither country had an advanced nuclear weapons program as North Korea did, and so I think from North Korea's perspective, I think they, that Kim sees Libya and Iran as what happens when you don't put all of your energies and that political capital and the enormous economic resources into building this program, and just in a single issue kind of way, really focusing on this program. But I'd also say that I think as the memory of, we're about to celebrate this month, right, is the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. And that's something that I think is as the memory of the Korean War among the people living in North Korea now starts to fade away, what the regime has done is to try to continue to revive the fears of a United States that wants to bomb North Korea in the way we did in 1950 to 1953, that it's to create this constant fear of the outside world, this constant fear that the United States is out to get North Korea and to raze it to the ground, and that it's that historical experience that Kim Jong Un has inherited, but also trying to build on to continually revive that. So that's so it's from North Korea's perspective, I think it's less Iran and Libya, but it's more of that historical, its own experience with war with the United States. So Dan, remind me, so it was the Libya and Iran, and also...
How does he look at lessons of German reunification and the collapse of the East when he's looking at specifically the Sunshine Policy right now and others? How does he look at that historical example?
And historians have looked at this, that, I don't think that, I argue in the book and elsewhere that Kim doesn't want peace. Peace means absorption. The South Korean economy, South Korea presents for Kim an existential threat. And so when South Korea continues to talk about economic engagement and cooperation, and when we talk about, when the U.S. and President Trump talks about this economic, a brighter future, American entrepreneurs or South Korean entrepreneurs going into North Korea, that's a threat for the regime. They don't want South Korean entrepreneurs running around co-opting their businesses because the disparity in the economic levels and the infrastructure and across the board, politically and economically, are so great that any kind of opening with the outside world would result in absorption. And I think that's the lesson of Germany as well, is that you have this existential enemy, but that any kind of opening, you get swallowed up. And so it's not just us that the North Koreans are afraid of, but they're also afraid of the South Korean prosperity, the South Korean model, being absorbed by that, by the business models there, the governance models there. And so I think that's Kim's lesson, is that, he has to maintain control. He has to make sure that under Kim, the defection levels have really plummeted because of the border controls and the surveillance networks. That while he's creating this alternate reality in North Korea, but he wants to make sure that that this is something that can compete with South Korea. and to ensure that people look inward for their economic prosperity than outward for their economic prosperity. And I think for the most part, the North Korean people, the North Korean bureaucracies, and the elite are with Kim on all of this.
And so the final question here is a very broad one, but I think it also dovetails into any concluding remarks that you might want to provide before we have to wrap up. Ultimately, what does Kim Jong Un want?
I think, thank you for that question. What does Kim want? I think I think he does want to have a prosperous North Korea across the board, not just muddle through the way his father did, where the elite were pretty much taken care of, but the vast majority, the 23 million plus in North Korea are just have to fend for themselves. So I think he does want prosperity across the board. I also think he wants respect and this international status and prestige, which I think the summits of the past 3 years, from 2018 to 2019, have done to provide some of that reinforcement for him. So respect, economic prosperity across the board. And I think he wants to push down a thriving North Korea, nuclear-armed North Korea, to one of his successors. And that he is still, he's planning not just for the present, but also for the future. Remember I said that the regime thinks in terms of dynasties. I think Kim too is thinking, continues to think of North Korea and North Korea policy and its relations with the outside world in terms of what kind of dynastic rule they're going to have. But at the end of the day, what we have to focus on is what's he willing to give up for that, and that has to be a combination of pressure and diplomacy, not just diplomacy with North Korea, but diplomacy with our allies and partners, and having the discipline and the leadership to really push the policy through in a sustainable way and to shape Kim's vision. So, if he does harbor offensive or aspirational visions about North Korean reunification or Korean reunification, his mind is not set in stone. I think we have to shape how he views and perceives the U.S., perceives U.S. policy, and perceives our relationship with our allies. So there's still space. There's space for that, and there will be space for that. But I think we just need to make sure that we do this in a consistent way.
I think we've pretty much come to the end of our time, but I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Pak, for spending this hour with us, helping us understand Kim Jong Un and North Korea a little bit better. One of the lessons, I think, very clear lessons of our national security programs has been how vital intelligence is, how vital understanding our adversaries' motivations, capabilities, etc., is to our ability to promote America's national security. So in addition to your work on this book, I just want to say thank you for your career commitment to supporting America's national security by helping us understand a very enigmatic adversary on the world stage. We very much appreciate your efforts. Thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your thoughts about becoming Kim Jong Un. It was a pleasure having you today. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Representative Nye. Thank you.
Everybody, all of our participants, thank you for joining us, and stay healthy and stay safe. Bye-bye.